The scream of tires against asphalt was not part of the usual soundtrack for the rolling fortress of black SUVs that constituted Donald Trump's motorcade. This was a sound of emergency, of a plan violently interrupted. The convoy, a symbol of unstoppable American power, was meant to glide to the world with an immutable force, a river of dark steel and political might. Inside the central armored vehicle, surrounded by the most elite protection detail on the planet, the former president felt a jarring halt. The world outside his tinted windows shifting from a seamless blur into a jarring, stationary snapshot. The familiar landscape of security, speed, and deference was fractured in an instant. On this day, against all protocol and probability, the unthinkable happened. A ripple of tangible tension surged through the entire line of vehicles, a current of alarm that connected every agent through a network of sharp breaths and tightened grips. Hands flew to earpieces, bodies tense into defensive postures, and eyes, sharp and scanning, swept across the surroundings for the source of threat. They expected a complex ambush, a coordinated protest, or a lone assassin. They were prepared for any manner of chaos. What they found was a different kind of obstacle altogether. And then they saw him, not a figure from a security briefing, but a single, older security guard, planted firmly in the middle of the private access road with the immovable presence of an ancient oak. His arms were crossed over his uniformed chest, and his face was a mask of grim, unyielding determination. He stood as a lone sentinel against a tidal wave of authority, a single man blocking the path of an empire. This was not a scheduled stop. There had been no warning, no deviation in the plan that accounted for this human roadblock. The guard, a man named Arthur Jenkins, operated on a simple and uncompromising principle instilled in him over 20 years of service. No one, under any circumstances, gets through this gate without the correct, verifiable credentials. For 2 decades, he had been the silent, unwavering gatekeeper for this private compound, a man whose life was built on the bedrock of procedure. He had never broken a rule, never bent a regulation, never allowed a friendly face to substitute for the cold, hard truth of a properly issued pass. The roar of the approaching motorcade meant nothing to him against the silence of his missing authorization codes. The lead agent, a man whose very posture screamed federal authority, was out of his vehicle in a flash, his voice cutting through the air with a sharp, practiced command. "Move aside. Now!" The order was meant to be obeyed without question, a verbal key that unlocked all obstructions. But Arthur Jenkins did not flinch. He met the agent's steely gaze with one of his own, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "No credentials, no passage. Those are my orders, sir." The words were simple, but their implication was monumental. A standoff was brewing not between nations, but between one man's duty and the immense power of the presidency. The most powerful man on earth, encased in the most secure vehicle on the road, was effectively stuck, his progress halted by the unwavering principles of one angry guard. The scene unfolded with surreal quality. The idling engines of the SUVs created a low, impatient growl that filled the air. Agents stationed around the perimeter communicated in terse, clipped sentences through their covert microphones, their heads constantly on a swivel, assessing this unique and unpredictable threat. For them, Arthur was an anomaly, a variable that did not compute within their sophisticated security algorithms. He was not a traditional hostile, yet he was actively impeding their mission. The lead agent took a step forward, his patience visibly thinning, his body language becoming more confrontational. "You have exactly 3 seconds to comprehend the situation you are in and get out of the way," he barked, the threat implicit in his tone. But Arthur stood his ground, his mind racing back to a phone call from his supervisor just an hour before. The stressed, impatient voice on the line had given a rushed order about a VIP route change. But when Arthur, out of pure habit and training, had asked for proper digital authorization codes, the response had been evasive. "It's coming, just clear the road," the supervisor had yelled. But the codes never materialized. To Arthur, this wasn't a minor oversight. It was a catastrophic breach of protocol. In his world, a rule was a rule because it was a thin line between order and chaos. What if this wasn't the real motorcade? What if it was an elaborate ruse by a hostile force exploiting a moment of laziness? His anger was not a personal vendetta against the occupant of the vehicle. It was professional fury against a carelessness that threatened to undermine the entire system he was sworn to uphold. He was prepared for the consequences, to be fired, to be arrested, to be publicly shamed. But he was not prepared to be the man who, through a failure, will allow a breach to happen on his watch. His entire career, his very sense of self, was built upon the foundation of following the rules, and he would not bend, not even for the imposing figure of a Secret Service agent or the ominous presence of the beast-like vehicle behind him. The air was thick with a standoff, a silent battle of wills between uncompromising authority and unbreakable duty. Who was this man, this lone figure daring to block the path of a presidential motorcade with nothing but his own resolve? To understand Arthur Jenkins in that moment of supreme confrontation, one must look beyond the uniform and into the fabric of his life, woven over 6 decades with threads of discipline, duty, and an unshakable respect for order. Arthur was not a reckless protester or an attention-seeking agitator. He was a retired military police sergeant, a grandfather, too, with a well-worn armchair in his living room, and a man whose entire worldview was built upon the sanctity of the chain of command. His rage, palpable in the set of his jaw and the steel in his eyes, was not personal. It was not driven by political affiliation or a desire for notoriety. It was a purely professional fury, a cold, hard flame ignited by the blatant disregard for a system he had spent a lifetime upholding. The genesis of this confrontation lay in a phone call received just 1 hour earlier, a call that had set this entire improbable sequence into motion. The ring of his secure line had sliced through the quiet monotony of his post, and the voice on the other end belonged to his supervisor, Mike. The man sounded uncharacteristically harried, his words tumbling out in a rushed, breathless stream. "Art, listen up, we got a situation. A last-minute, high-priority route change. A VIP motorcade, and I mean the highest level, needs to use the private access road in approximately 60 minutes. I need you to clear the road and stand down. This comes from way above my pay grade." There was a pause filled with the static of the line, and Mike's anxious breathing. For most people, the phrase VIP motorcade, coupled with highest level, would have been enough. It was an unmistakable euphemism, a code understood by everyone in their line of work. But Arthur Jenkins was not most people. His mind, trained over 20 years in uniform and another 20 in private security, did not process the request through the lens of implied authority. It processed through a strict binary protocol. He responded with calm precision, his voice a low rumble in the receiver. "Understood. I will need the proper paperwork. Mike, the digital authorization codes for a protocol breach of this magnitude. Please transmit them to my terminal for verification." On the other end of the line, Mike's patience, already frayed by the pressure from his own superiors, snapped. "The codes are coming, Art. They're processing it now. Just clear the road and stand down. That is a direct order." The volume and stress in Mike's voice were meant to compel obedience, to short-circuit Arthur's methodical process with the sheer force of hierarchical command. But Arthur's programming was too deeply embedded. "I cannot clear the road without the correct codes in the system," he repeated, his tone even and unyielding. "It's a breach of procedure." The call ended with a sharp, frustrated click from Mike's end, leaving Arthur alone with the hum of his equipment and the weight of his duty. He waited at his terminal, his eyes fixed on the screen where the digital authorization should appear. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. The designated 60 minutes came and went, and the space on his screen reserved for the official, cryptographically signed code remained blank. To anyone else, this might have been a simple bureaucratic delay, an administrative hiccup. To Arthur, it was a catastrophic security failure in the making. His mind, a repository for countless threat assessments and security briefings, began running through scenarios with cold, clinical efficiency. What if the motorcade approaching was not the real one? What if it was an elaborate and sophisticated deception, a hostile force exploiting a moment of laziness and assumed authority? In an age of advanced weaponry and digital espionage, the most vulnerable point in any system was often the human element. The guard who decided that a phone call was good enough. His entire career, his very sense of worth, was built upon the foundational principle that procedure existed for a reason. Those codes were not just digital bits. They were a verifiable chain of custody for responsibility, a way to ensure that every action was accounted for and every order was legitimate. He would not bend. He would not make an exception, not even for the growing roar of approaching engines that now vibrated through the soles of his boots. As the massive SUVs materialized from the distance, their dark forms growing larger and more imposing with every second, Arthur stepped out from his booth and onto the warm asphalt of the access road. He positioned himself directly in the center of the lane, a solitary figure against an oncoming tide of power. The lead vehicle did not slow, its driver likely expecting the guard to scramble out of the way at the last possible moment. But Arthur held his ground, his heart hammering against his ribs not with fear, but with a righteous, focused anger. As the vehicles finally screeched to a halt just feet from him, all he could think, the mantra repeating in his mind with the clarity of a struck bell, was, "They didn't follow the rules." His anger in that moment was not a hot, blinding rage. It was a shield, forged in the fires of basic training, tempered by decades of thankless vigilance, and polished by the simple, profound belief that doing your job correctly was the highest form of honor. He looked past the blinding headlights, past the heavily armed agents now spilling out of vehicles, and saw only the breach of protocol. He was prepared for the consequences. He was prepared to be fired, to be arrested, to have his pension stripped away. These were tangible losses he could comprehend. What he was not prepared for, what he could never live with, was the alternative, being the one man, the one broken link in the chain, who let a catastrophic breach happen on his watch because he decided that the rules were for other people on other days. His entire life had been a journey to this single point on the asphalt, a test of whether his principles were just words or the very substance of his character. Back in the motorcade, the tension had reached a critical, almost unbearable breaking point. Inside the lead vehicle, agents were communicating in a staccato burst of coded phrases, their hands resting on the butts of their concealed weapons, their bodies coiled like springs ready to release. The directive from the command post was clear and imminent. The obstinate guard was to be considered a passive physical obstruction, and they were authorized to remove him with all necessary and appropriate force. 2 agents from the follow car had already begun their advance, their movements crisp and synchronized, their focus locked on the solitary figure standing between them and their cleared route. They were seconds, mere heartbeats, from taking hold of Arthur Jenkins and escorting him, none too gently, to the side of the road. The entire security apparatus was poised to enact its will upon this single, unyielding man. Then a new, countermanding signal was passed through the encrypted earpieces of every agent on the scene. The word was simple but utterly confounding. Stand down. All units, stand down. Confusion rippled to the protective detail. This was not protocol. This was the inversion of protocol. The source of the counterorder became apparent a moment later. The reinforced rear door of the central SUV, the immense and legendary vehicle often referred to as the Beast, swung open with a heavy hydraulic sigh. And there, to the absolute and utter shock of everyone present, from the most junior agent to the most seasoned political aide, was Donald Trump himself. He emerged from the armored sanctum of the vehicle, ignoring the frantic, whispered warnings of his detail. His expression was one of intense curiosity, not anger. He straightened his suit jacket with familiar tug and, without a glance back, started walking with deliberate steps directly toward the guard. A wave of controlled panic swept through the Secret Service. The scenario they trained for involved shielding the protectee from threats, not watching him walk purposefully toward an unknown and unvetted individual. This was a security nightmare unfolding in real time. From the press van further back in the convoy, a flurry of activity erupted. Camera lenses, long and powerful, were shoved against the tinted windows, their operators zooming in to capture every single second of this unprecedented and historic scene. The world, through the lens of the media, was about to witness a moment of pure political theater, completely unscripted. The lead agent, his face a mask of professional stoicism over personal alarm, barked a series of commands. Instantly, agents fanned out, forming a tight, moving protective perimeter around the former president as he walked, their eyes scanning the rooftops, the tree lines, everything but the man they were actually converging upon. They moved as a single, disciplined organism, their primary instinct to place their bodies between their protectee and any potential threat. But Trump, with a dismissive wave of his hand, gestured for them to give him a bit of space. It was a small gesture, but its implication was enormous. He was insisting on a degree of normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. He walked right up to Arthur Jenkins, closing the final few feet until they were standing mere steps apart. Arthur, for his part, did not move a muscle. He stood at a modified position of attention, his back straight, his hands at his sides, his heart pounding so violently against his chest he feared the former president could hear it. The idling engines of the SUVs created a low, pervasive growl, but in that immediate space between the two men, the world seemed to have gone completely silent, holding its breath in collective anticipation. The entire sequence, from the door opening to the face-to-face meeting, had taken only seconds, but it felt like an eternity to everyone watching. Instead of yelling, instead of demanding an explanation or gesturing for his agents to have this man dragged away in handcuffs, Trump did something that defied all expectation. He looked the guard up and down, his gaze taking the crisp uniform, the polished boots, the unwavering posture. He assessed Arthur not as an obstacle, but as a specimen of a rare breed. And then he did the unbelievable. The stern expression on his face softened, and the corners of his mouth turned upward into a small, knowing smile. It was a smile of recognition, of one strong personality acknowledging another. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and carried with an easy authority over the rumble of the engines. "You're not moving, are you, son?" he said. The use of the word son was not condescending. It was almost paternal, a term of address from a man accustomed to command to one who clearly understood it. Arthur, his throat tight with a mixture of fear and resolve, met the former president's gaze. He could see the cameras, the ring of tense agents, the immense power represented by the man standing before him. Yet he saw it all through the lens of his duty. His voice, where he found it, was firm and resolute, devoid of any tremor that might betray his inner turmoil. "No, sir," he stated, the word simple and direct, not without proper authorization. There was no apology in his tone, no plea for understanding, just a simple, factual statement of his position. He was not defying the president. He was upholding his orders. Trump absorbed this, his head tilting slightly as he processed the man's unwavering stance. He nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. The look on his face now was one of genuine, unfeigned appreciation. He saw in Arthur a reflection of a quality he had always claimed to admire, an unshakable will. "You've got guts," Trump said, the words carrying a tone of finality and respect. "I like guts. You're doing your job." In that simple declaration, the entire dynamic of the confrontation shifted. It was no longer a power struggle. It was a validation. The man who had blocked the path of power had just had his principle and his courage acknowledged by the most powerful person on the scene. What happened next was not merely an exchange of words, but conversation that would be dissected, analyzed, and replayed on endless loops across news channels and social media platforms for weeks to come. For 2 full minutes, a sliver of time that felt both instantaneous and eternal, the former president of the United States and the anonymous security guard stood in the middle of that access road and engaged in a dialogue that transcended their vastly different stations in life. The world, via the zoomed lenses of the press corps, watched with rapt attention, witnessing a human drama unfold against a backdrop of immense political power. The air was thick with the smell of hot asphalt and vehicle exhaust, but the focus remained entirely on the two figures at the center of the impasse. The conversation began with a simple, almost rhetorical question from Donald Trump, designed to establish a baseline of understanding. "You know who I am?" he asked, his voice carrying a tone of curiosity rather than challenge. He was testing the waters, gauging the man before him. Arthur Jenkins met his gaze without flinching, his military background keeping his posture ramrod straight. "I do, sir," Arthur replied, his voice clear and respectful, yet devoid of any sycophancy. The acknowledgment was made, but it changed nothing. This was the core of the standoff. Recognition of authority was separate from the verification of it. Trump then posed a logical follow-up, the question everyone from the Secret Service agents to the television audience was thinking. "And you still won't let us through?" The query hung in the air, a direct challenge to Arthur's logic. Without a moment's hesitation, Arthur delivered his unwavering position. "Not without the correct codes, Mr. President. My orders are protect this post." In that sentence, he defined the entire conflict. His duty was not to the man, but to the post. His loyalty was not to a person, but to a set of rules designed to ensure the post's inviolability. This distinction, this unwavering commitment to principle over personage, was what captivated the watching world. Instead of taking offense, Trump seemed to find profound value in this display of integrity. He turned slightly toward his lead agent, a man whose face was a granite mask of professional concern, and gestured toward Arthur with a nod of his head. "See this," Trump said, his voice dropping into a more conversational, yet still audible, register. "This is loyalty. This is someone you can trust." The statement was a public commendation, a validation of Arthur's character in the midst of the confrontation. It was as if Trump was pointing out a rare artifact, a quality he believed was in short supply. He then turned his attention back to Arthur, his eyes narrowing slightly as he pieced together the administrative failure at the heart of the problem. "They didn't send you the codes, did they?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. Arthur's reply was a simple, factual confirmation. "No, sir, they did not." There was no accusation in his voice, no blame placed on his supervisor or the system. It was merely a report of factual omission. A low, knowing chuckle escaped Trump's lips, and he shook his head in a gesture that conveyed a mixture of amusement and frustration with bureaucratic incompetence. The sound was unexpected, cutting through the tension, and signaling a shift in the dynamic. The situation was no longer a threat. It was a logistical problem to be solved, and he was the man to solve it with a decisive movement. He gestured to an aide who had been hovering a few paces behind him, a young man clutching a secure smartphone. The aide rushed forward, and Trump issued a quiet, curt instruction. The aide immediately began dialing, his voice a low murmur as he spoke to someone on the other end, relaying the specific demand for the missing digital authorization. The next 60 seconds were a study in surreal suspense. The motorcade remained frozen, a sculpture of dark metal and dark glasses. The former president stood patiently, his eyes occasionally scanning the surroundings but always returned to Arthur as if he were a fascinating specimen. Arthur remained at his post, his heart still thumping, but now with a dawning sense of incredulity at the entire situation. Then the vibration came, a sharp, insistent buzz from a phone clipped to his duty belt. With deliberate movements, Arthur unclipped the device, his eyes never leaving the former president, as if to assure him he was not reaching for a weapon. He looked down at the screen. There, finally, was the string of alphanumeric characters he had requested over an hour ago, the official, verifiable, cryptographically signed authorization code. His eyes scanned the numbers and letters, cross-referencing them with the format he knew to be correct. He verified it. The process was complete. Only then, with the protocol fully satisfied and his duty honorably discharged, did Arthur Jenkins move. He took a single, sharp step to the side, clearing the path for the motorcade. His right hand came up in a crisp, formal salute, his fingers aligned, his posture perfect. It was a gesture of respect, not to the man, but to the office, and to the resolution of the conflict according to the rules. Trump observed the salute, a final, definitive act in their brief but intense drama. He reached out and clapped Arthur firmly on the shoulder, a gesture of masculine approval and closure. "You're a good man," he said, the word simple but carrying the weight of his persona. Then, as he turned on his heel to walk back to the imposing safety of the beast, he delivered a line that would become the headline for countless news reports, a parting shot that cemented the moment in the public consciousness. "The country needs more men like you." With that, he disappeared back into the vehicle, the door closing with a solid, final thud, leaving Arthur alone in the middle of the road, the authorization code glowing on his phone screen, and his life irrevocably changed. The motorcade, its momentary disruption already a fading memory for its passengers, rolled on toward its destination with a renewed sense of purpose. But behind it, the incident left a ripple that would quickly swell into a tidal wave of public attention. The story, captured on shaky smartphone footage from the press van and narrated in real time by breathless journalists, began its journey across the internet before the last SUV had even disappeared from view. Within the hour, the video had gone viral, metastasizing across every social media platform and cable news channel. The image of the stoic, uniformed guard standing firm against a wall of dark vehicles was irresistible, an instantly iconic tableau for the modern age. Arthur Jenkins, a man who had lived his life in the quiet shadows of duty, was thrust into the blinding spotlight as the angry guard, an overnight sensation for reasons he never could have imagined or desired. The court of public opinion convened immediately and was sharply divided. Pundits and commentators fought rhetorical battles over his actions in a sprawling digital arena. Some praised him as a hero of integrity, a modern-day David standing against a Goliath of federal power. They held him up as a symbol of the everyman's courage, a testament to the idea that principle should not bow to authority. Talk show hosts lauded his unwavering commitment to protocol, arguing that the nation's security depended on exactly this kind of unyielding dedication to the rules, regardless of the pressure applied. On the other side of the spectrum, critics lambasted him for what they called dangerous grandstanding and a reckless abuse of his limited authority. They painted him as a stubborn bureaucrat, a man so enslaved by petty regulations that he would risk an international incident and disrespect a former president. They questioned his motives, suggesting he had sought this confrontation, hoping for the exact fame that now enveloped him. His life was suddenly not his own. It was a topic for debate, his character dissected by millions of strangers from the comfort of their living rooms. Yet for Arthur, insulated from the initial media storm within the quiet walls of his home, life began to change in more tangible and personal ways. The first tangible shift came the very next morning, cutting through the noise of his ringing personal phone, which he had since unplugged. It was a call on his landline from a number he did not recognize. The voice on the other end was polished and direct, the CEO of a prestigious private security firm known for protecting high-level corporate executives and international dignitaries. The man got straight to the point. He had seen the video and was profoundly impressed. He was offering Arthur a senior consultant position, a role that would involve designing security protocols and training their top-tier personnel. The salary mentioned was several times what Arthur earned, and the responsibilities were a significant step up. When Arthur, stunned, asked why he was being considered, the CEO's reply was simple. "We received a call," he said. "A strong recommendation from a very influential source. They said your integrity is your greatest credential, and that is the only currency we trust in this business." The recommendation, it was heavily implied, had come from the highest of places, a silent nod of respect from the very man whose path he had blocked. Arthur never sought the fame that had been thrust upon him. The television interviews, the newspaper profiles, the constant scrutiny, it all felt alien to a man who was simply built to do his job correctly. For him, the gate was not a metaphor, it was his post. The rules were not suggestions, they were his commands. The person on the other side, whether a delivery driver or a former president, was irrelevant to the sacred duty of verification. He was a man out of time, a relic from an era where a handshake and a promise were enough, and he applied that same antiquated code to the complex, modern world. In doing so, his story transcended the 24-hour news cycle and became something more enduring, a modern fable about the power of principle. It was a story told in boardrooms and barracks, a parable used to illustrate the value of standing by one's convictions. The incident proved a profound and universal truth that sometimes standing your ground against the most powerful forces in the world is not an act of blind anger or foolish pride, but an act of incredible, quiet courage. It demonstrated that true strength is not always found in aggression, but often in the resolute, unshakable calm of a person who knows their duty and refuses to be moved from it. Arthur did not shout. He did not brandish a weapon. He simply stood. And in that simple act of standing, he challenged an entire system, and in a strange way, earned its ultimate respect. In a world increasingly full of compromise, where allegiances shift with the wind and principles are often negotiable for the right price, that kind of unwavering integrity, that steadfast commitment to one's duty, remains for many truly unbelievable. The motorcade moved on, but Arthur Jenkins stayed, becoming a fixed point in the national consciousness, a reminder that sometimes the greatest power is not in moving forward, but in having the courage to stand still.